As you can see, for our next presentation, we have two presenters. Kyle Bersted and Joe Smetter will present a paper on the effects of Nintendo Wii play on mental rotation abilities.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks a lot for coming today. I'm Joe Smetter.
I'm Kyle Bersted.
And we are presenting our project, Closing the Gender Gap in Visual Spatial Skills using the Nintendo Wii. And we did this under the mentorship of Dr. Isabel Cheney.
And so basically just a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're first going to go into the research literature on spatial abilities, which is basically the point of this study. We're going to talk about what that is and why it's important. We're also going to examine there's a gender difference in spatial abilities. And so we're going to talk about that and possible reasons for that, which as you can see, confidence and past spatial experiences are both hypotheses that have been proposed. We are then going to talk about video game training and how that's been used to try to close this gender gap. And so then that will lead us straight into our actual study that we did this summer. We'll go through the method, results, and discussions.
Well, Caitlin already did a great job of sort of explaining why women in science is such an important issue. And our project kind of tackles that from a different perspective and sort of trying to solve a specific problem of difference between men and women in spatial ability, which can be translated into this issue of science fields. Spatial ability is defined by Terlecki and Newcomb as the capacity to represent and transform symbolic or non-linguistic information through space. And like I said, it's critical for physical science, architecture, medicine, dentistry, chemistry, and engineering, as well as just everyday tasks like reading maps that you and I do every single day.
And so as I said earlier, there are gender differences. This is pretty clear in the research. Men outperform women on spatial abilities, or they have higher spatial ability. And so one of the many ways of testing this is mental rotation, and this is an example of the test that we actually administered. This is basically being able to rotate an object on its axis, in a 3D image in your mind. And so this would basically be, there are two pictures that are the correct, that match the first one, and you are asked to identify those. So that is kind of what mental rotation is. And in the literature, mental rotation, more than any other task, actually shows the most robust gender difference. So that's kind of why we're interested in examining.
There's several hypotheses about why this gender difference in spatial abilities just in general exists, and one of them is spatial experience. And boys tend to play with more toys that require spatial manipulation, and they play more sports and video computer games than girls, and those are tasks that require a lot more spatial manipulation in the mind. And Boyer found that many women who preferred spatial toys as children had higher mental rotation task scores.
And the other possible reason for this gender difference is confidence. It has been shown, Cook, Simpson, and Boyer, as well as other studies, that men tend to have more confidence in their mental rotation ability, as well as they are better able to predict how they do. So they have, it seems, a better grasp on the task itself and thinking about how they do on the task. And so that confidence may also be a reason why there is a gender difference.
There's a base of scientific literature that looks at the utility of video games in training spatial abilities and improving spatial abilities for both men and women, and then also specifically for each gender. And video games have consistently been shown to improve spatial skills under a large variety of circumstances, such as one study that Dr. Cherney did, and many others that look at different genres of video games, different types of spatial ability, all sorts of different variables.
And so, looking at trying to close the gender gap, there are mixed results. There are various studies out there. Dorval and Pepin did do a study where male and female participants improved about the same with video game training, whereas this study that Joe just mentioned, Dr. Cherney's study, women showed a greater improvement as compared to men when exposed to video game training. So further research is needed to see exactly what the effects of this kind of training are for men and women.
So in addition to examining just this general issue, we also had sort of a unique aspect of our study in we wanted to look at the Nintendo Wii, because the Nintendo Wii is it's a motion sensing control interface, came out in 2006, and it's been marketed to a wider range of unconventional gamers, including older populations and women. boys significantly show more interest and experience with video games than girls, and the Nintendo Wii has been successful in cornering its market, especially females ages 25 to 34. And so the Nintendo Wii specifically has not been examined in this video game spatial training literature so far. So me and Kyle thought that it would be interesting to look at it, because if females are more geared towards this certain system, maybe it would have differential effects in how it affects their spatial abilities.
And so our three main hypotheses, I should say. First, we expected men to outperform women on the pre-test MRT that they took before they were exposed to our study, because that is consistent with literature. We also were expecting the video game conditions, Wii or GameCube, which we'll go into, would be more beneficial for women compared to men, which goes along with Dr. Trinity previous study. And then this one, as Joe said, the Wii is kind of absent from psychological literature, so this was more of a hunch. We thought that maybe since geared towards females, the Wii might be make more improvement for females, but also just the nature of the Wii. You're actually moving around, you're on a board, you're going like this, things like that, as opposed to the conventional game system. That may have some effect on your spatial ability, since you are more in tune to the game. So that was our last hypothesis.
So moving on to how we kind of set up our study and executed it. We had 60 participants, 60 undergraduates, 30 men and 30 women, about a mean age of 20 years old.
In our materials, as I said earlier, the mental rotation test, which I showed you a little bit, there's 24 of those questions, 8 minutes to complete. That's the first main material that we had. We also had a basic survey from Terlecki and Newcomb, and then we also added additional questions. These are basic GPA classes, but it also we added questions asking about their video game experience, how often they play, what kind of games they enjoy, things like that. And then we also had the childhood activities questionnaire that was created by Dr. Trinian, the Boyer, and that's basically assessing what kinds of activities you took part in as a child, whether that's playing with blocks, playing with dolls, sports, things like that. So that assesses your masculine and feminine experiences, but also your spatial experiences, is what obviously we were interested in. In the games, there was a Wii condition and a GameCube condition, and then a control condition. The Wii condition was the Wii Fit Segway Circuit, so if you guys have ever played Wii Fit, you have to stand on a board, and they basically have to lean forward and back to move themselves around a 3D island, basically, and driving themselves. So it's kind of fun to watch. So it's basically a 3D island, and they had to collect balls, look at a map, and then in a time limit. And the Crazy Taxi was a more conventional video game controller, GameCube, a little bit older game. You drive around, pick up participants in a 3D environment, bring them places for money in a certain time period. So both involved navigation in a 3D environment. And then the control was just simply, we had a word search, Sudoku, crosswords, things like that wouldn't require any spatial task in the brain.
So for each participant that took part in our study, they were initially randomly assigned to one of the 3 conditions that Kyle just described, training type. And when they came in, we administered a pre-test of the mental rotation test, followed by the SSRA and childhood activities questionnaire to collect all that survey data from them. And then they had 30 minutes of their assigned training conditions. So they played either game for 30 minutes or sat and did puzzles for 30 minutes. We asked them to, in between the first and the second session, to refrain from video game play in that interim time. And 48 hours later, they came back for their second session, where they started with 30 minutes of their assigned training condition, so an hour total of playing the game or whatever. And then we had them take a post-test of the mental rotation test and looked at the improvement and their scores on those tests from pre to post.
And so to get a little to the results, we have a ton of results, but we're just trying to pick out a couple main ones. First, t-tests did show that men significantly outperform women on the pre-MRT, which is what we thought. That's consistent with literature. Men are better at that than women originally. However, at the end, and this is looking at all participants, no matter what condition, there was no longer a significant difference between men and women's post-test scores. So we'll get into what that may suggest in the discussion, but that is the first point.
One of our main results, we controlled for their confidence and their estimate of their performance. So we basically took whatever differences may be due to those factors and statistically eliminated them to sort of isolate the effect of the training type more. We found a significant interaction between condition and gender when looking at post-MRT scores and just video games in general versus the control. So we found that, as you can see from that graph, women in the video game conditions scored much higher than women in the control conditions, and the differences between men were not even close to being as robust.
And so then, breaking the Wii and GameCube apart into separate conditions, we did find a significant main effect for women in that this looking at MRT improvement as opposed to Joe was just talking about their post-test scores. So this is how well they did from the beginning, or the first one to the second one, how much they changed. And so it was clear that women in Wii and GameCube increased significantly more than women in control. And so this is looking at, regardless of where they ended up, this is just looking at their improvement. And so it's clear that the video games were significant for women, whereas men, there was, again, no significant results.
So men significantly outperformed women on the pre-MRT. That was on par with all the rest of the studies, well, the large majority of other studies that we examined. And the fact that no significant gender differences on the post-MRT were found suggests that the gender gap was closed in the case of our study.
And as Joe was talking about earlier with the first graph, we did have a significant interaction between gender and training type when looking at post-MRT scores. And so this, again, as Joe said, was women scoring high, having higher post-MRT scores in the video game conditions when compared to the control. And so this suggests that video games may be effective in closing the gender gap when compared to males.
And then looking just kind of at the effectiveness of the training and how much it affects men versus women again, we looked at MRT improvement, and we controlled for internal factors, the confidence, and external factors, or the spatial experiences that they had as a child. And we found similar results for each. In each case, we found a main effect of training type. So video games were better for participants overall than the control condition. And the interaction between gender and training type was not statistically significant, but it was approaching significance. It was getting close. So that suggests there may be a gender factor in there somewhere that would be able to be fleshed out statistically.
And then, like we said, the last thing, there was a main effective condition for women when comparing consoles, so looking at all three conditions. And women in the Wii and GameCube conditions did have greater improvement, as I said. And so this suggests that video game training may be more beneficial for women as opposed to not really as much of an effect on men. So,
some limitations to our study, we had a lack of variance or variability in our sample. We used all college students from Creighton University, so not a whole lot of diversity there. We also worked within a relatively short time frame, short amount of training, so we aren't sure if these effects are generalizable and longer lasting or not.
And so just for future studies, maybe to extend studies like this to children to try to identify the gap and do something about it early in age. And then elderly adults, Wii is used for physical rehabilitation, things like that. So maybe could extend that to that as well. Like Joe said, more variance in our samples and larger. We're kind of limited here within the summer, with the students that were around. Looking at long-term effects as opposed to short-term. And then use of different games, it's kind of hard. We tried to make two games that were relatively similar in their function, but again, it's hard to assess how similar they really were. There were differences, most notably the Wii conditions, worked up a sweat. Got a little frustrated, got some calf workout, but that's for future studies looking at different games. And here are our references, and we just want to thank Dr. Cherney so much for all her help. It was really, we really appreciate that, and we really wanted to say thank you to Creighton as well for the opportunity to fund this. So thank you so much.